Welcome back. Whilst we're still on the subject of children all over the world, there are children in prison for various reasons. One such case is that of Ahed Tamimi, who is an activist in the occupied West Bank. In December 2017, she was detained by Israeli authorities for slapping a soldier. Her story has prompted international debate and further condemnation of the Israeli government and military. A campaign to free Ahed Tamimi and all child prisoners is gaining momentum. To talk more on this, we are now joined by Fasiha Hassan. Fasiha, you are part of this campaign. What is it called in general?
So basically it's a campaign to free not just Ahed Tamimi, a very well-known young activist, but it's also to highlight the plight of Palestinian children to the rest of the world, and to highlight the fact that the Israeli regime has been using very brutal and very ridiculous measures to not just harass Palestinian people, but also to arrest Palestinian children. As it stands, there are thousands of people under the age of 18 who are, according to the UN children, who are actually currently in prison. And Ahed Tamimi is one of those people who happened to be arrested at this particular juncture.
Now, what happens in instances where children are used to commit crimes? Shouldn't they be arrested or detained?
Look, I think that the Palestinian question is not one which children are used to commit crimes. The Palestinian resistance is one for self-determination. It's one in which their land has been occupied, they're currently being oppressed, and I mean, it's very much an apartheid state. It's what South Africa was, 24, 25 years ago, but worse. So I think there's no question on whether children are being used for criminal activity. Children are freedom fighters in that space. People are resisting an occupation and resisting an oppressor. So that's not necessarily a discussion of where we are right now. The discussion that we should be having is the force that the Israeli military and that the Israeli regime has been using to clamp down on human rights activists. I mean, these are young kids. We met them recently when they came, and they are very forthcoming, and they call themselves freedom fighters. These are children, 11, 12, some of them are 6 and 7 years old, who go up against Israeli soldiers. I mean, they're not armed, they're quite literally children.
Mossad says all the liberation movements in Palestine use children as human shields and women in some instances. But because we're focusing on children here, I would like you to talk to that fact, or to that point, that now in instances where these children are used as human shields, what happens? Does Israel then not have the right to defend itself, as they would say?
We must problematize this issue of Mossad using this argument of human shields. Very, very often it's used as an excuse, actually, to attack civilians and to attack unarmed civilians. There have been many documented cases, not just by the UN, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, by very well-known international NGOs who have highlighted the fact that this argument of human shields, number one, is not true. But number two, is being used as an argument by the Israeli regime to ultimately attack unarmed civilians. This has happened. The reason why Ahed Tamimi was in such an altercation with a soldier is because an hour or two before that, her cousin had been unarmed, shot by an Israeli soldier in the head. Now, this is one example. Over the last few weeks, we've seen particularly many more young, not even young people, but Palestinian activists being killed in the Gaza Strip because of their also the fight for self-determination. Again, unarmed people. Again, the fact of the matter is that people are going up against live ammunition, tear gas. I can't even explain to you. This is a war zone in which people are quite literally fighting for their human rights.
Now, is Ahed a political activist or a child prisoner?
Both. Ahed is 16 years old. She was, I think it was in grade 11, the equivalent of grade 11 and matric. Yeah. Of course, she now can't finish school because she's been arrested. So she is a child prisoner as it stands, but she's also a political activist. She's also a freedom fighter. I don't think that there is a separation here. When people are arrested, they're arrested because they have gone to the front lines, they're in the picket line. Some of them weren't even, but some of them were, in their fight for self-determination, in the fight for Palestinian freedom. So the two are not mutually exclusive.
So when we talk child prisoners, I mean, there are many other countries where children are detained, children are arrested, in other instances perhaps being used as drug mules, and you know, the Palestinian one becomes a different thing. But I just wanted us to broaden the subject a bit and say, when you talk of child prisoners, internationally there are many children who are languishing in prisons for various reasons.
Yes, exactly. You know, today, even though I sit here and I speak of the Free Ahed Tamimi campaign, you're quite right. Across the world, young people and children have been used, like you said, not just in the issue of drugs, but also in war zones. And that's something that we can never, ever be comfortable with. It's something that we need to take a stand for. We need to understand that there are places in the world where young people can't be children. When we think of children, we think of being carefree, we think of people, young people who are able to express themselves. And unfortunately, that's not the case, particularly in Africa, particularly in South America, particularly in the Middle East and in Asia. And that's something that we need to highlight. So I think part of the idea as well, in the Free Ahed Tamimi campaign, like we said, it's about freeing all child prisoners. It's about highlighting that now there are probably thousands across the world, young people who, like you say, are languishing in prison as we speak.
And in Africa, actually, you also have the problem of child soldiers. I mean,
particularly in the DRC, correct, in Cameroon and North Africa.
Yeah,
yes.
South Sudan as well. So what do we do? And I go back to this point that, you know, whereas perhaps I had maybe a different case altogether, but you have instances where children are committing serious crimes, whether they be misled or misguided or led or guided by adults into those type of activities, but at the end of the day they are criminals.
Look, I think we have to assess the root cause of the problem. Very often people will say, oh, I've been robbed, you know, I'm very traumatized. Sure, that is true, but we're not looking at the root cause of the problem. And very often it's number one, poverty. It's number one, being in a war-torn space. It's number three, just the desperation to being able to put food on the table and like you said, being used as a tool in a greater political battle. And so when you look at and identify those root causes, then you can say, well, let us actually deal with the problem here, which is less the symptom. You know, it's about dealing with the actual so-called disease, the so-called cancer in society. And that's where we come in also as the international community, to say that not only to highlight it, but we need to also be willing to take our gloves off and go there and physically also get involved and do what needs to be done. And for me also, just a closing point, what's particularly important, I also think, is an element of education. And it's easy to say, hey, let's educate young people. What I mean is to go into these spaces, to highlight the problem, and to then also say, what can we do to get young people educated and to give them more meaning in life?
What is the state, as we wrap up, what is the state of Ahed Tamimi's situation right now? Is she going to court anytime soon? What are the conditions under which she's being held? And what are the authorities that are keeping her safe? So
in Palestine, particularly in the West Bank, they're under military rule. And Ahed has appeared before a military court, which is actually something that's very problematic. It's not like a formal court system as we would think about it. She has appeared, and they've actually charged her, or rather sentenced her, to 8 months in prison as it stands. Now that has meant that she can't study. She's basically, this was a matric student who now can't go back to school. I think there's been minimal contact with her family. In fact, when she was arrested, her mother and her family members were also arrested. And quite recently, her cousin who was shot in the head was also abducted by intelligence officers of the Israeli regime. So the situation is very dire as it stands. And like I said, she's not the only one. Ahed is merely a figurehead and a metaphor for so many other people whose stories are not known and who are under also severe brutal treatment from the regime as well.
Is she okay though?
I don't know how okay you can be when your state is being occupied and you're currently sitting in jail as a 16-year-old for fighting for your human rights. It's a difficult question to answer. I don't know how one can be okay.
Fasiha Hassan, thank you very much for making time this late.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Now.